Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go over BIM and how it can improve the design and workflow efficiency. This is a professional practice network PPN webinar. Myself, I'm Matt Wilkins. I'm hosting it as the PPN chair. Just a little housekeeping here. So there's 20 PPNs. There's over 12,000 members in the PPN network. And some of the platforms that we use to network in are the Field blog page, LinkedIn pages, as well as some other platforms there to communicate. And this is one of our exciting things here, to be able to share some of our information via these online learning series. So thank you for joining us today. Just heads up that this is eligible for professional development hours. If you have any questions or have any need any information on that, feel free to reach out to us or send something in the chat there. But if you're needing any development hours, you're at the right place here. This will be recorded, so afterwards you can download this from ASLA, and feel free to reach out to us as well. We're happy to include any additional information. Usually there's some Q&A or some other questions there that sometimes you may want to follow up on. And just so you know, we will have a section for Q&A at the end. So if any of the questions are sitting for a while, that's something that we're keeping an eye on, but we will be facilitating at the end. And I covered that there. So tech support, if you're having any issues, please feel free to reach out as well. We do have tech support on the side here, so feel free to send a chat, and that will get picked up. And or click the request support button at the lower left of your player there. So just want to kind of jump into the presentation here. So again, my name is Matt Wilkins. I'm the current chair for the Digital Technology PPN. I'm also an associate at K2A Planning and Landscape Architecture. Presenting with me today is Robert Anderson. He's a principal and really the leader of his firm on the East Coast. And Eric Berg, who's also presenting with us. He's a senior associate landscape architect at Pacific Coast Land Design. Some of the learning objectives for today, we want to really learn how CAD and BIM workflows can help with the design and just the overall efficiency of your office there. And then identify just some of the tools and again, go over the workflows that are available. And then also explore some of the uses of BIM in conceptual drawings and models and construction documents, so kind of front to end. And then understand how BIM can be used for applications like LEED sites, different state and federal review processes. So again, my name is Matt Wilkins. I have about 10 years of experience, both academic and professional. Been with K2A for about 7 years, working on really an array of design and planning projects, from large-scale master plans, community plans, regional plans, down to just small details. For instance, just the other day, I was working on a detail for a trellis and getting down into, what lumber size and bolt size, etc. So kind of cover a variety of ranges there. K2A has been in business for about getting close to 50 years, so we have a lot of knowledge in-house, and there is kind of a good collection of information there just in terms of our personnel. So we have about 40 people on staff, and that covers landscape architecture to planning, and then some other technical trades, GIS, and other design professions. As the Digital Tech PPN chair, really I'm kind of the forecaster of what technology is moving in the field right now. And this is just a word cloud, kind of a literal word cloud, I guess, but just showing some of the trends and topics that we cover. Of course, today we're talking about BIM. But what is BIM? We'll cover that today, and I'll kind of go over just the definitions and different type of tools that are out there for use. But before that, I just want to set the stage and kind of go over just some of the societal advances that have led up to where we're at right now. This is a graph showing Moore's Law, and as you know, it kind of covers the exponential growth that we've seen thus far with computing. And to me, what's fascinating there is within the last 10 years, it's just been such a jump in mobile devices, but then also just processing power, not only on your local devices, but moving over to cloud services. And as we'll talk about today, that offers us a great deal of flexibility in terms of processing power and leveraging that for some of these programs. On top of that, there's an abundance of information that's being shared, and all of this is connected, as you know, through the World Wide Web as well as other type of services there. And it's really fascinating to see all this information and how it, again, could be leveraged to help us as designers. One thing that's really fueling this is the Internet of Things, and this was fascinatingly really brought up at the Consumer Electronics Show about 5 to 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago even, and it's just exploded since. And you're starting to see all these devices come online that allow us to gather information and, again, use that to inform our design. So there's really just this abundance of information. And, again, as designers, it's about how you can reach out and grab some of that information to help better inform you in your design process. This is a continuum of scales that, to me, is very relevant. Again, as I mentioned, I have the ability to jump from scale to scale, but as you can see here, this is kind of an excerpt there from a book on geodesign by Carl Steins, and Carl and I were talking through various things on another presentation. We were just kind of talking about how different technologies work into these scales. And so what I did here is augment in the different programs that are applicable for each scale. So on the right, GIS programs are more applicable for the larger ecosystem and larger scale projects. But then when you get down to the site scale, that's where these CAD and BIM programs become more applicable. But then you really get a mix in between. And as we'll talk about today, there's a lot of tools within the BIM environment to allow not only site design, but regional design. So coming back to the question of what is BIM, and just want to define it a little bit. The history of BIM, there's an architect, Bill Bernstein, who first used the term BIM, and this was way early in this I believe in the 80s or 70s. But Jerry Lasserin really helped to popularize and standardize that term. There's some photos of the two gentlemen to the right there. But the first implementation was really done in 1987 by Graphisoft with the application ArchiCAD, I should say. Here's just a couple definitions that are floating around on the web. So this one's by Autodesk, and their definition is that BIM, Building Information Modeling, is an intelligent 3D model-based process that gives architecture, engineering, and construction professionals the insight and tools to more efficiently plan, design, construct, and manage buildings and infrastructure. I think the key words there are really just that it's a 3D model that gives insight and tools to better plan, design, and construct projects. Landscape Institute defines it as an integrated process that's built upon coordinated and reliable information about a project from design through construction and into operations, and that it will help improve coordination, enhance accuracy, reduce waste, and enable better informed decisions earlier in the process. What I like here is that they're starting to talk about the life cycle and how BIM can be used later on in the life cycle to help really inform operators and other owners and management teams there on a building or landscape. Here's a definition that us three kind of came together and said, well, this I think kind of really summarizes what we think BIM is. And really it's just a digitally shared process of data-rich 3D information, and it's organized to better inform key decision-making throughout design and construction of a built system. So again, it's really a process of information, and its goal is to help inform decision-making and design, essentially, and then also transcend into construction and post-construction. BIM can also be defined in a series of levels. BIM level 0 it's almost just drawings on paper and very rudimentary CAD. In the middle of this graphic, you can see there's this timeline, and what I think is fascinating there is you can see BIM level 2 and 3 kind of splits that mark between the 2010s and 2020s, and so as we get into BIM level 2, which what we call true BIM, where you actually have information or families or these objects that are informed or coded with information that's used, that's kind of true BIM in our definition here. BIM level 1, just a step back, is really just 2D and 3D. So a lot of offices, and our office primarily works in that realm still, where a lot of the work is done in CAD and done kind of in this linear workflow. And then if we ever need a 3D model, that's a separate workflow. We have to export out line work and recreate a base and start to illustrate this model. And sometimes we'll do that very crudely and draft on top, but a lot of times we try to take that further along for design. But really tying the two together is where you see, BIM level 2, where you can do all your modeling and construction docs there. And then what's fascinating about BIM level 3, going back to my previous slides, is that it's really a sharing of all this information, kind of on a collective web service. And we'll briefly talk about that, but we're getting there just in terms of some of the tools and technologies available. BIM is also 7D, and that's kind of an obscure term there, but really the 3 dimensions we're familiar with, that's kind of our physical realm, but it's also defined as having these other 4 dimensions, and really that's anything from scheduling to estimating, kind of transcending into kind of the post-occupancy reporting, sustainability, and facility management. One of the fascinating things is that BIM is really being pushed in Europe, and there's all these different mandates that are requiring design professionals to use BIM. As you can see here, there's a lot of countries really signing on or have signed on within the last year. The UK, there was a big kind of discussion about that within the last couple of years of how BIM is really influencing and kind of changing the workflow there because of these mandates. And that's happening in other large countries in kind of Western Europe there, such as France, Germany, Spain. Some of the Nordic countries, such as Norway, Finland, have signed on very early, and Denmark as well, and have kind of proved the use of it. So I think that big conversation for us, at least here in the U.S., is, are some of those mandates going to reach us? And if so, what impacts will that have to our design and current workflows? So what's really driving this is the need to work both efficiently and effectively to solve critical world problems. And as you know, there's several world problems out there, and as designers, we're sometimes tasked with finding the solution to these problems. And again, it's about how you use the information available to better inform that process and come up with the best effective measure for that design challenge. Just to kind of anchor it down in terms of where we're going with it and the growing demand, this is a graph by, I believe, the Construction Institute that shows the growth, really, of BIM just within the span of 2009 to 2012. It's pretty remarkable to see how many contractors are using this, and I haven't really found an updated graph, but I can imagine that's probably somewhere in the 80s to 90s now in terms of how many contractors are using it, and then even more so for engineers and architects. So it's growing quite a bit. This was an interesting stat, at least I saw recently, that really shows, and this is by globalnewswire.com, but it's stating that there's going to be, or projected to be, a 20% growth between 2017 and 2020. So there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of growth. And I think, again, it's prudent for us in our profession to really look and explore what's available for us. This is a graph that I put together. It's kind of a spin-off of another graph, just showing, again, the efficiency of BIM. To kind of just dissect this a little bit, so the orange and the blue graphs there really show what can happen if you take your traditional drafting-centric workflow, which is number 3, that blue line, and shift it over into a BIM workflow. The thought there is that you can capture that time into the front end of the design and really allow for the design to improve and spend more time there exploring options and coming up with, and then really allowing the technology then to help aid in construction documentation and construction management. So really you're kind of taking that same time and just shifting it to the front end. And so there's an ability to impact the cost and performance, whereas if you look at number 3 there's a lot more cost and design changes down the road. So that's where the number 1 and 2 kind of overall graphs kind of pull in there. So just a little overview on the platforms. This is a image that was put together by Lauren Schmidt. So credit to her. And I thought this was very interesting because it helps to kind of graph out the different technologies that are available, and kind of explore, which ones are most relevant to landscape architecture. So just to talk about the different software that's available, and then also discuss some of the difficulties in transitioning. We actually, as the PPN, issued a survey a couple years ago and are looking to do another one this year. But we really sent out this survey to a lot of practitioners, a lot of universities and professors, as well as students, to gauge what programs are using, and then also what technologies are they exploring. And interestingly, and I guess it's not really shocking, but a lot of firms are still using the traditional AutoCAD and SketchUp suites there, really, to kind of do all their construction documentation, illustrations, etc. And then Adobe Creative Suite to either put things into more of an illustrative Photoshop graphic or InDesign type of things there. But as we'll talk about today, there's a lot of benefits in combining all that into a BIM workflow, and you can actually save some money there as well. And then again, drafting software, AutoCAD just dominates there. Civil 3D and Revit kind of follow behind, and MicroStation and Vectorworks actually have a strong stance as well, and those are growing a bit more. And then for 3D, SketchUp pretty much dominates it there as well, with Rhino and 3ds Max kind of following. And then for rendering, again, Photoshop is kind of the lead rendering or post-processing, I guess, platform to help with illustration. So there's really this whole ecosystem of software that's available to us. And again, as design practitioners, we have to really think about, okay, well, what software is the most useful? What's going to cost the most, or at least offer the most return for that cost? And then you can start to really build what softwares are needed, I guess, for your firm. This is representative of what we use at K2A, just in terms of software packages. So again, AutoCAD is dominant. There's also a lot of SketchUp. We do use GIS quite a bit, and a lot of the Adobe suites, but we're starting to use Vectorworks and Revit a bit more, really to explore all these different options that are available using this BIM workflow. Some of the things that really drive this are really just kind of the common factors, such as office infrastructure. Do we have computers that can process that information? That becomes a big hurdle there sometimes. And then staff knowledge as well. Do we have staff that can jump into a specific software and start working? And then the cost of the software is a big factor, but really what's pushing most of it is market demand. And a lot of times, we're very sensitive to our primes, our consultant teams, and if there's a specific demand for something, we'll explore that. And that is the case for many of the software suites that we're using today. Some of these things were pushed just in terms of the design industry, and AutoCAD had that kind of life to it as well, where initially when we started it, it was to work with engineers and architects and kind of start to work in this digital type of workflow. One of the fascinating things is there's this very controversial project in Los Angeles, California, where they're looking at a master plan really for the entire LA River. And it was a project that was really publicized, and a lot of landscape architects were somewhat upset to see the results of the winning team, which was an architect, a pretty big architect in the LA area that won this project. And so they really saw that there was an efficiency there in their workflow in using these BIM technologies. So why not site or landscape information modeling? This is something that we raised in some other articles. So one is the limits of BIM. We talked about these different factors that are kind of weighing in there. And then we talked about it as well in the field. I wrote an article about information modeling and just asked the question if we're there yet. We'll talk about some of that today. AIA actually defines BIM in a series of interoperable links or platforms. So some of the leading protocols there for these softwares or BIM processes are well, I'll just kind of go down quickly down the list. IFC is one of the leading kind of import-export file exchange formats, but then COBE and some of the others. And so really what AIA is doing is kind of stepping back and saying, hey, this is not one particular software. It's really a workflow. And as long as you can interoperate with these type of platforms or these files, then we're achieving that goal of being kind of BIM oriented. So again, another overview of the platforms. Some of the leaders in this graph, at least, are AutoCAD and Revit, and I think that's represented in some of our studies as well. But some of the high performers in kind of growing into the leaders are ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, and DataCAD. So again, I come back to Lauren's graphic here, but I wanted to show one that I put together just looking at the different BIM levels and kind of augmenting that in, and then showing what's most useful for landscape architects. And right now, I mean, we use a lot of AutoCAD and Land Effects, and that gets us right almost to the edge of BIM Level 2. But then jumping into BIM Level 2, Vectorworks is really one of the and this is kind of an opinion, but we found that it's one of the strongest tools out there in allowing for landscape architects to use some of the information that they have on plant material, irrigation, etc. But then also Revit and some of the other tools are very powerful as well, especially when you start to combine them with plugins such as Dynamo and some other things there. So again, it's the need to work through these smarter workflows for design efficiency. And I'll go through some of these workflows. So just to touch on kind of the BIM Level 1, and I'm going to fly through these slides. So this is your traditional workflow: AutoCAD, Land Effects, SketchUp, etc. Most everybody's familiar with that, but there are other tools to kind of get you a little bit more informed. You can use plugins such as GIS that allow you to bring in information and look at different parcel data or anything that relates to the shape files there. And then you have all these attribute blocks, and you can look at augmenting in even photographic aerial surveys there and information to better inform you on that process as well. And then there's some powerful tools in Land Effects even to do site planning and some really preliminary costing, as well as just being able to kind of map out a site and start to look at some of the uses there. And then you could take this into SketchUp and further illustrate some of those systems or the flows throughout the site. And then obviously that transcends into your traditional CAD workflow, where you can export that out and make these illustrative graphics through Photoshop or other means. and then again in SketchUp to be able to visualize that and then study it, do shade studies, and really gather information. But again, the reason why I show this is because you can see that various tools and softwares that are needed to really execute a project. And right there, I mean, that was about 5 or 6 programs, and this is 3ds Max and some other tools there to create that graphic. But I do want to touch on just some of the other tools. So InfraWorks is a really powerful engine. There's a lot of procedural tools within InfraWorks that allow you to map out infrastructure and other systems. Civil 3D is very powerful. It's, again, another augmented source on top of CAD, similar to Land Effects, but allows all these scripted-in tools for sculpting and processing civil-related items and utilities, etc. MicroStation is a powerful tool. There are some nuances, but one of the nice things about MicroStation is that there's this shared file that team works on. And then one of the tools that I've been fortunate to use is LumenRT, which is similar to Lumion, but it plugs right into kind of the Bentley workflow there and was recently purchased by Bentley a couple years ago. SiteOps is another really powerful tool. Allows you to lay out infrastructure and things at a site level, parking lots, etc., and do these very quick what-if scenarios. But jumping into BIM level 2, that's really where we get into some of the tools we'll talk about today. ArchiCAD is a very powerful, a little bit more oriented to architects, but it interfaces using the ILC and other BIM formats that I talked about. Keysoft is another suite that offers some tools in BIM, and again, interfaces using ILC. But Vectorworks Landmark, we'll talk a bit more about today. And there's a lot of BIM tools for landscape architects and allows a variety of scales within that platform. So again, looking at that scale of continuum there of different scales. Revit and Dynamo is actually a workflow that I'm starting to study a bit more on and explore different possibilities. So it really allows for the streamlined integration, though, with Revit, and allows you to use Revit, which is kind of the primary tool right now for architects. And so there's a lot of benefit there. And Dynamo allows for this open source information to allow information to be kind of brought into Revit that's really not there now. And so I'll show you some of the advantages there. But just a little background, some of my history in Revit. Actually, I got started very early in actually doing EIR reports and visual simulation. This was a project in San Diego where I'm located, which was colloquially called the bunny ears, but it was a Revit model that I took and then was able to illustrate. I just did a project recently in Metropolis, downtown LA, one of the biggest projects going on in downtown LA, where I took this Revit file and from various architects actually, and then created a simulation or a series of simulations illustrating what the signage will look like there. One thing I want to note, though, is that when I was receiving all these files, there's about 3 gigabytes of files that I had to work with, and so these files aren't small. And we'll talk about that a little bit today as well, but kind of going again to this cloud system, that's where some of these advantages come in of, sharing kind of a central file and using information abroad or storage abroad. This is a project I worked on in downtown San Diego where we actually worked with the architect through some of their BIM tools and Revit and helped to produce these calcs on load and weight on top of this existing rooftop deck, and then came up with this design for a green wall, which was kind of a focus point there for the rooftop. But I want to talk just briefly on Dynamo. So there's custom scripting that you can do in Dynamo, again, to assist with your workflow. And you can do these type of marionette scripts through Dynamo where you can link in various information, such as plant information, families, etc., and then start to produce these graphics that we're familiar with, where you end up, bringing in planting legends and other information from outside data sources. So you can leverage some of the nursery information or Excel data that's available on the web, and then come up with a pretty reasonable and graphically pleasing type of construction plan that uses some of the BIM tools there, but it's somewhat limited. There are some ways to kind of tweak it, and what we're finding is that you have to kind of work through some of the nuances, but allows you some of these rudimentary tools to get to the same output there. So I just want to pose this question. I'm going to segue over to Robert here, but what are some of the factors that influence your firm to change in some of the challenges faced? So with that, I'll hand it off to Robert.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I appreciate it. We're going to try to go through this next few really quickly here. So you all have seen my bio probably, so I'm not going to really bore you with that. But suffice to say, I've seen the arc of change over the career from drafting by hand all the way up to through CAD to now BIM, and I would contend that I think that the whole change that we're seeing as it relates to CAD, from hand drafting to CAD, now CAD to BIM, is that same kind of paramount kind of shift that we're seeing that I think is like daunting for a lot of people and why they're having issues. I'm currently in New York City, but I've been doing consulting and practice on my own now for 10 years, and I provide training in consulting services for other firms who are making that transition. So why did we switch? Well, for me personally, it was more a matter of just trying to kind of get out of AutoCAD and into something different, because I wanted to be in a Mac-based platform. But some of my clients and other firms, they were more interested in trying to leverage other tools that were out there. And one client, he actually said it was because he felt he was being escorted by the other software provider. So they switched to a BIM platform from another provider. Matt kind of touched on this idea of this kind of shift in the fees, and I just wanted to touch on it again real quickly. That this was the hope of what after CAD would be, that we'd be able to do more design development and rather than spend a lot of time in construction doing paper drawings. But in reality, what the clients ended up doing is, oh, well, you can build a little faster now, so we're going to give you a less fee. As far as the timeline and some of the kind of issues that we had, this is based on one of my clients, their transition, where they started in 2011 and now they're off the chart here on this thing, but they've kind of incrementally introduced the projects that were being done in Vectorworks Landmark, and have slowly kind of adopted all of the features. They're still doing a little bit of drafting in 2D kind of idea, but they're moving on now into more 3D design. There's a lot of concern about the interportability, and again, Matt touched on this briefly, but there was a bit of an issue with that interportability. An IFC file is really the best way to do it. And here's a project that I worked on with a firm using Revit, and they were super pleased with the prospects of switching that over. And then there's the kind of the pop at the end of the rainbow, the thing that we're looking for, which is being more cost effective and being efficient. And this is just projects that I've worked on with one particular client over the course of a 4-year period. And you can see where our efficiency, we were taking a hit up front on design fees. We were kind of losing a little money, but after a couple of years and everybody being brought up to speed, you can see we're really starting to tear into being much more profitable. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric. And Eric, if you'll go ahead.
Thanks, Robert. Good morning, everybody here on the West Coast. Afternoon on the East. A couple of things about our transition. I'll kind of skip over the intro stuff about myself here as well in the sake of getting through some of this. We're a small office here in Ventura, California, Pacific Coast Land Design. We consist of 9 people, and one of the big things with this conversation is that has really driven, it's one of the factors that has influenced us. We're a small office, but I'd like to think that we're a small office that can act like a large office. And really, that was one of the big factors in choosing a BIM software and making this transition. That, along with cost. One of the first things I'm going to do here is lay out just kind of this idea of what a workflow is. Traditionally, prior to our transition, sorry for the delay here. I've developed a graph here that kind of maps out the design process. So through the course of a design, from genesis to construction administration, we all know as designers that design is a nonlinear process. You're constantly going back and forward, but you're being kind of drug along on this process from genesis to construction administration all the way through because the project has to move forward. I mean, I've always said as a designer, if I had it my way, I would just be designing all the time. Thankfully, I have a client that pulls me through from beginning to end. And at the same time, we have to produce these plans, sections, renderings, reports, these different deliverables. Now, in a traditional office, prior to us transitioning to the BIM, our workflow looked like this. We weave a web of interconnected workflows. Apologies for these not working yet. Hopefully, you'll see them again here in a second. Another one of the things is prior to 2008, I just wanted to show an example of what our workflow kind of looked like. And on the bottom here, you can see this graph shows, again, from genesis to construction administration, and the composition that different softwares provided and that we used during that process. One of the things I want you to pay attention to here is the reliance on Photoshop and Illustrator early in design and SketchUp. Those were really what I like to call parts of one-off processes where you would spend a lot of time each time the design changed updating those outputs. If you wanted to do anything in 3D and change it, you had to do that both in your design plans and in SketchUp. After we made the transition, we transitioned to Vectorworks in 2009, and you can immediately see the domination that one software platform took in our workflow throughout there. One of the reasons we chose to use it also as a small office was cost. We were no longer paying for all of these separate platforms, and we were able to consolidate during a hard economic time, 2009, into one software and really spend that time streamlining our workflow. We try to produce as much out of that. Now that we've kind of become more accustomed to it, our workflow's changed a little bit, and we started adding on a couple of little software packages here or there. You can see Lumion showing up there. We haven't gotten rid of AutoCAD. We still use it for coordination. We have to. And Photoshop is still there for site cleaning some stuff up. But again, right in our workflow, Vectorworks is the big one. Another one of the reasons that caused us or that allowed us to change is this idea of switching from this workflow. So what we want to do is try to produce a linear workflow where we're not weaving a web of secondary workflows, sending plans from AutoCAD to SketchUp, SketchUp to Photoshop, Photoshop to Illustrator, vice versa, all these different things. We like to, or ideally, we want to keep everything linear. So we're using one software to produce things continually throughout the course of the Another one of the big things, you can see here how that's actually applied. So this is a preliminary rendering of a project. We're able to utilize that capability to produce both preliminary and construction document renderings at the same time. So we can go back and forth between construction documents and preliminary renderings like this, all the meanwhile at the same time. None of this is happening in separate workflows, producing renderings that show what it's going to look like. Doing overlays. You can see on the right there a existing, proposed, and actually after it was completed using this software. Enhanced collaboration is a big part. You've seen a few word clouds today. Here is just some of the different file types that we have to encounter on a daily basis. And having a software package that can deal with these and work with these so that we're less reliant on asking our consultants or the clients to translate stuff into different files and working on that. One of the big ones here is IFC that we're starting to utilize as a collaboration resource between us and Revit. And then ultimately what BIM is all about. So we use Vectorworks. Vectorworks has this capability of allowing us, again, to have, in this case, plants in 2D representation for preliminary, but also at the same time, that same object carrying construction visualization, 3D visualization, a bunch of data attached to it, a whole bunch that you can leverage to produce custom schedules. And all of this being supported by a workflow. You can see a little video on the bottom where we're just planting a line of trees based on data that we've inputted in there, a workflow that really supports how we want to plant, and then instantly being able to see the results of design. So going from 6 to 16 plants on a schedule and instantly updating that. We use it for boulders. We have 2D, 3D representations of boulders. We can schedule that into both quantities, and you can see here we quantify our boulders in tonnage, so we can get cubic footage of actual modeled boulders that we can then use to estimate how much they're going to weigh for cost estimating purposes and for quantifying in bids. And then linking that directly to detailing that shows up on our plans. Irrigation is one of the big ones that we rely on. Land Effects offers a great irrigation tool. Vectorworks now offers a great irrigation tool as well. And the same idea, having components with this data. So instead of holding onto that paper catalog, that Hunter paper catalog that you may have, this data is embedded. This catalog is embedded in the software. We can pick, in this case, a Hunter i20 head and use it to do our design. All of the data that would be associated with that is built into the program and supported by a workflow that leverages that the way as a designer would to see the difference between design and calculated information, how that affects pressure, how that affects flow, and then also having it show up graphically so that we can use it in our plans at the end of the day without having to go through some secondary process. And then here in California, one step, we've developed a workflow that allows us to take this and leverage this in. So as the design changes, our required state water use calculations, the MWELO, many people around the country have heard about it. We have some of the strictest water use regulations in the country and have to provide this table on every project that we do. So it was critical that we find a way to do this efficiently. We used to do all of this in Excel. So if something changed, you would plug in a number and change the numbers. Now our design builds this calculation. I'll show a little bit quickly about that later. And then being able, again, to use all the tools out there so we can pull stuff off of different things. In this case, SketchUp's 3D Warehouse, to find the myriad of models that are out there to help us design and pull the design elements that we really want to use. It hasn't been without its challenges, and I want to talk briefly about that. There's a couple things I'm going to plot out on this graph. So you can see here our collective knowledge and skill over time from 2007 to 2017 has slowly grown in the ways of BIM. But one of the challenges, you can see when we made that switch, and then when I joined PCLD in 2013, and when we left AutoCAD, along with that has come this exponential growth in file size. As we get better with the software, we're able to produce bigger file sizes that our computers have a harder time using. That's a constant thing we're struggling with, and we have to leverage that against, we can only invest in new computing power so often, and so we're always trying to feel like we're playing catch up or hopefully sometimes ahead of the curve, but it's an issue that we deal with on a daily basis. How much is too much to model? What are some of the specific projects or examples that we have completed using BIM? I'm going to go over a couple projects really quickly, a couple examples of how we're using BIM in our process to produce beautiful projects. The two projects I'll talk about are Kellogg Park and Westview. First, Kellogg Park is a 2.5-acre park here in Ventura. Talk briefly about collaborative site modeling, working with a civil engineer in 2D, 3D world here to model a site and produce documentation out of it. So we work with the engineer to survey the site. He's able to give us that information in 3D, and we can use that to turn in to, here you're seeing a top plan of the grading, existing grading, and then the bottom left, a 3D axon there. These are happening at the same time. It's just a different view of the model. It's very important in this that they say, you understand that they're saying. So when you see that, these are just separate views. We can then analyze that for flow. This is a very flat site. The flow arrows are going everywhere, but you can see how we can start to use these tools for analysis. Again, just a different view of the same thing. We can analyze it for slope, set the parameters to see where we might be running into problems for slope. Now, again, all very green, very flat site. And then start to lay our design out and start using 3D tools to carve away, just like a bulldozer would. We're using 3D tools. So one of the first things we did was carve out this drainage swale idea using 3D tools. You can see in the bottom left. And then building the design around it, eventually turning that into what we call 3D break lines. These are 3D polylines that we share with our civil engineer. Our civil engineers use Civil 3D predominantly. We can share this 3D data back and forth. He's using Civil 3D, I'm using Vectorworks. We can both then use it to produce real models and do our studies off of. He can make updates and send me back polys, and I can update mine, and vice versa. Then turning that into the 3D site model that you see there with the design, starting to analyze that. Here you see a cut fill analysis, a slope analysis of the proposed on the same parameters, showing the design with the contours, filling that out to start to get to a preliminary design. And then we were using that to get to preliminarily renderings in Vectorworks. This is a rendering done in Vectorworks. Now we found, you can see here, the population of plants here. Vectorworks is a traditional rendering software. We found that this render took over a day to make and weren't really satisfied with the results. So one of the big things we've gotten into is these new OpenGL things. Matt mentioned LumenRT, Twinmotion, Lumion are some of these new engines that are using OpenGL technology, kind of like a gaming engine. And now we can sync back and forth our design with that to produce much better renderings in much less time. So, for example, these renderings took about 30 seconds to render. And you can see the park there. This next picture is actually that same view a week ago. Coincidentally, just as an anecdote, you can see the black in the back. Many have heard we're in Ventura. Ventura was just subject to the Thomas Fire, largest fire in the state of California's history. It burned that slope right there in the back, very close to our park. So, but it's coming along very well. It should be open in April. We also use this during construction administration. I'm going to go through this really quickly. You can see here how we had an issue with a plaything. A play manufacturer. We had to move a piece. You can see there the A and B of it moving. Using the software to do that, but then also to coordinate with the contractor this difficult install, where we were able to utilize Vectorworks and Lumion to show them what was going to go on with the underground footings, how this thing was going to get built. Clay surfacing, wood chips, and sand. You can see, and then again, this was actually last week, a picture of the thing constructed. Westview, I'll talk about briefly. The big things with Westview is it's a affordable housing thing, but it's also a LEED ND project. So we're able to use Vectorworks to do our entire preliminary studies. Again, this is all of these graphics you're seeing are being produced out of Vectorworks, our design software. So things from exploded axons, here's an illustrative site plan. This is always there. Everything you see here are just different studies of the same model. We're not producing these in a separate program. Extensive data on existing trees. Working with an arborist to coordinate those, and then deciding which ones to save, which ones to remove based on that information. Looking at circulation, Paving materials, trying to figure out a balance on cost, where to spend our money on more expensive paving materials. Infrastructure, producing that cut axon at the same time looking at it planned, so we can really have this systems discussion early on and how we expect this to work. Doing another kind of cutaway section where we're looking at this as a gray water laundry collection system to back out to irrigation, how this might work. This was early on a concept that we developed without spending a lot of time going back and forth. Looking at planting, different types of planting, that's tree planting versus the other planting. And then looking at irrigation water use. What is that planting, how that affects our irrigation at the end. A little more detailed about how gray water might impact irrigation. And then being able to use that with Excel to graph, doing a very complex parking count. And again, all the while maintaining this representation. I mentioned earlier that this is a lead ND. We were able to document all the different credits that we were going for using lead ND so that the documentation works in on the back end. Open space, tree line shaded streets, two different calculations for both area and linear footage being produced out of this plan. Again, water efficient landscaping, analyzing different components. And then some lead for home stuff. And then also that same thing in project visualization. So working with the architects using IFC interchange to bring in their building, see what that might look like. That was when we were using Vectorworks. Now we're in Lumion, and this is what it looks like there, where we're sharing the same stuff. We build the model in Vectorworks, but we're able to share real time back and forth with Lumion. This project is actually currently under construction, the first phase of it as well. I wish I had some pictures, but we're not quite there yet. And then I'm going to blow through this at the back time using the same process to do our construction documentation. Here you can see a little run through of how we're actually doing our irrigation calcs. I'll go back there for a second just to show you that. The blue shapes you see on the right there contain data that we then use to update our water use calculations that are required by the state. So that's a little bit of like inner workings of how we're doing that as part of our workflow. And producing hydrozone maps and filling out required information. Here's a look at those water use charts and the complications. Like there's 3 different irrigation components here all going together that all have to have separate required calculations, and seeing that we're meeting the requirements set by the state. Also being able to analyze gray water demand versus supply. And then being able to schedule an irrigation. All of this is being done by those little blue shapes that I just showed you on a couple slides ago. As we design and update those, where this information seamlessly updates all information that's required for our plan processing. And then at the end, having an irrigation plan that looks the way we want it to. Planting's the same way, and I'm just going to kind of quickly go through these slides here. Ultimately, the last thing is design detailing. I'll just show you from like concept through documentation how we looked at the infiltration on this project, and we're able to focus down the design. There you can see some of the above ground, underground, and now here's the design detailing that we sent to a manufacturer, and then being able to actually produce the section cuts and the design details necessary to build that planter. Hand it back over to Robert. He's going to talk about some of his project experience now. So thank you, and we'll hopefully talk here at the end with some questions.
Thanks a lot, Eric. In the interest of time, I realize we're going to be kind of bumping up against our deadline. We've only got a few questions. If we have a moment afterwards, if some of you can hang around, we'll get to those. We'll keep on carrying on. Matt, if you wanted to chime in here, I'm just going to kind of move through these, and maybe you can read to us the questions you've gotten.
Sure. Do you want to go ahead and go through your slides, and then we can, at the end here, we'll jump into some of the Q&A?
That's nice and all of it. We are right at the 2-hour mark, or at 2 o'clock. So I'm not going to be showing anything more than what you all have already indicated, with the exception of some other things within Vectorworks, as you can see on the screen here as the years are advancing. We're just talking a little bit more about the construction detailing side, the scope of the projects, the intensity of the work that's done, and how we use the same features that Eric intimated just a minute ago on how this shapes the BIM information, has all that data so that when you have to go back and produce documentation, you have everything at your disposal to do analyses and quantifying things. So it's really kind of, these are really just some of the same things, just different projects shown at a different scale. So I think, it's abundantly clear how intensive this is and how rich the data is. So I don't want to take too much time kind of dragging out how we did different things and produced all these drawings using BIM information. So if you want to just kind of pick it up from there.
Sure. So I'll jump to a question from Renee. It's asking if we can explain the BIM capability of Vectorworks, and I think that may be relevant as you're flipping through some of the slides, if you can kind of address that. I guess just how Vectorworks fits that BIM category.
Yeah. So it is pretty incredible, and I think when I mentioned it early on, how this is kind of like the next giant leap. It's going from hand drafting to CAD. It seems like a daunting thing, but once you do it, you can see that the opportunities are there to really kind of improve overall design effectiveness. And this is one classic example. I did this solar analysis for this project here in New York City to illustrate to our client. In the interim, Vectorworks has added augmented reality through the ARKit kit with iPhones and iPads, and I was able to actually show them a 3D model in the real setting of that trellis. So the BIM and how it carries through all the data has been pretty impressive, and how all these things, these are just models, the same model with just sections cut through to illustrate how the construction is going to be done, including annotations, fasteners. Matt, you were talking about, getting into the weeds and details. Well, this kind of is the ultimate in that. Going into like worrying about how many fasteners are going to be in the job, I can do a quick takeoff on the BIM model to illustrate that. So it's been, it's pretty intensive in how that works.
And I'll jump in on that too, BIM capability of Vectorworks. One of the big things with Vectorworks, Renee, is that you can literally assign any kind of data to anything. Now, Vectorworks comes out of the box with certain things that already have the ability, or they're called plug-in objects that already have data attached to them. So, for example, in Vectorworks, there's plants. Plants have a database that's attached to them, so you can assign a specific, in AutoCAD speak, it would be a block. In Vectorworks speak, it's a symbol. You can assign a specific symbol a specific plant definition that carries through, and you're able to document everything that's tied to that definition. Similarly, irrigation heads have a catalog information. So all of the information that's associated with, in my example, a Hunter I-20, down to its pressure loss specs, that sort of stuff, is attached to those irrigation components. You can draw a simple line and tell the software that line represents a pipe, that it costs this much, that it's made of this material, and then represent that in Schedule 2 all on your own. So there's built-in stuff, and then also the endless capability of adding data and representing that data in schedules, worksheets, visualizations.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, guys. And then I'm going to jump to another question from Adam. He asked if we can explain briefly the different software packages and how they relate to the different type of platforms, such as Mac or PC.
Maybe you guys could touch on Vectorworks. Chime in on that one. Yeah, I'll chime in on that because I work in a Mac environment, as I indicated here at my office, but many of my clients are on Windows. In the days of you got to convert the file from a Mac platform to Windows, those are gone. That happened when Mac switched to Intel chips. Wow, that's about 8 years ago, maybe now. So, yeah, there's no compatibility issue. You could even in the same work environment have Macs and Windows machine working on Vectorworks files without any issues at all. Like I said, I do it all the time. As far as some of the other platforms, there is no Revit for Mac. Matter of fact, there's only AutoCAD Lite for Mac. So if that's kind of like the slant you're going for, it's you get to be fairly limited pretty quickly on what your options are. But then, so that you eliminate that problem with the compatibility because you're going to have to be on a Windows platform for other software packages.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that too because I was one of the individuals at our office that was kind of torn between Mac and PC. We're PC-based in our office just due to the very software that requires that. But I would have my MacBook on the side because I just preferred to use it, especially with some of the Adobe products there. But it was somewhat challenging there in that sense of, taking homework because that was my personal laptop, but then, I was also doing some, work on it. And the ability to, for instance, draft or, take CAD work home, you're very limited there in terms of the software capability. So fortunately, Vectorworks does work almost seamlessly on both interfaces there. And I believe I don't know if you guys have familiarity with the PC side. I believe all the tools and the interface is pretty much the same. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're a PC office. We use Vectorworks on the PC. I use a Mac at home. I can run it on both. And I actually personally prefer the PC, coincidentally enough, to the Mac operation. Part of that is probably because of the processing power of my work computer versus my personal laptop. But some of the other software we talked about, Lumion is PC only, whereas Luminar T is Mac. I believe it has Mac capabilities. It might be Mac only. I'm not sure about that.
Both, yeah.
It's both. So that's something I run into. I'm not able to work on our Lumion on my home computer, but it's PC only. Again, Lumion's not really a BIM software, but more a visualization software.
Awesome. So I'll jump over to another question. And Eric, I believe you someone addressed this. This is from Todd, and he was asking if, let's see here, AutoCAD, Vectorworks, can function only for DDs and CDs. So I guess the question there is, really, does Vectorworks allow you to work for DDs and CDs there? And I think we kind of illustrated that.
We did. I'll just quickly talk about that. Thanks, Todd, for the question. We use Vectorworks solely for DDs and CDs. All of our documentation is done in Vectorworks. We do use AutoCAD, and if you ever make a transition to Vectorworks, your reliance on AutoCAD, I would say, is as much as your necessary need to coordinate with consultants. So the main thing we use AutoCAD for is just we communicate back and forth in DWG still, and we just send stuff to AutoCAD. We still have versions of 2004 AutoCAD in our office. That's all we really need to look at those files, clean them up, make sure our consultants can read them, and then bring them in. So we haven't made significant investments into the AutoCAD side in quite some time. We just basically use it for coordination.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on that. I think the whole promise of BIM and 3D design is that you jettison the idea of like, oh, I'm going to work in this one platform, then I'm going to transition over to this other platform and do the final construction documents. I think with both Revit and Vectorworks, and my main experience is with Vectorworks, of course, but is that it's that whole thing. You do the conceptual design. Probably not schematic, you just do that by hand, but you do the CD, the conceptual design, and that same model kind of matures through the whole process until you're down to doing the actual, cutting sections and detailing and annotating. So it's, I think that's, for both any kind of BIM platform, that's kind of the idea of this, don't have to go switch it back and forth.
Exactly. I think that concept is unfortunately best illustrated in a couple of the graphics that didn't work during my section of the presentation. I encourage you, if you download the PDF, you'll see those little graphs there that kind of illustrate the intricate web of the current workflow where you have to steam back and forth between different softwares, and this promise of a more linear workflow that you can utilize in Revit or Vectorworks, where you are working on the same model to produce your documentation throughout, same software.
Great. I'll jump to another question here from Sean that talks about what hardware aspects are most important for BIM. Is it RAM, GPU, CPU? Do you have to have a solid-state hard drive, etc.? So if you guys can touch on, what hardware you're finding is most needed for these softwares.
Robert, do you want to chime in real quick?
Yeah, on the hardware side, a lot of these things are benchmarked. If you go to Vectorworks, they'll show like the minimum operating standard. I think it's probably more a graphics card kind of thing, particularly if you're going to be doing a lot more of the 3D design and you want to move around within the model and not have any latency. RAM is going to be leveraged mostly when you're doing the actual, processing model or doing the digital terrain modeling, which we didn't even talk about, but, that digital terrain modeling is also in that BIM environment. So, I'm using it's older now. It's a 2013 Mac Pro. And I don't want to tell you the specs on it because it's a little scary, but it's all solid state. But I think the Windows machines that I've used at some of my clients, they're not setting the world on fire. It's just a video graphics card been really the main upgrade that they've had to go with.
Yeah, we've upgraded all of our graphics cards to more gaming engine graphic cards, and the reason for that is that the Lumion uses an OpenGL platform, which relies heavily on a GPU. If you're going to do your rendering within the rendering suite of Vectorworks, which has it actually relies more on the CPU to render stuff and not the GPU, unless you're moving around in the OpenGL world. And because that takes so long, it demands more. We made a switch away from that to use more OpenGL type software so that we can invest in our in the graphic processors instead of the CPUs. So it's kind of an interesting thing and about what software platforms you want to go with. Simply, we went that way because of time. We couldn't afford to spend the time rendering CPU intensive realistic renderings anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add briefly on that, just from the Revit perspective, that there is also some requirements almost for the Revit software to work on machine. And I'm actually looking at a site right now, so they're saying a minimum of 4 gigabytes of RAM. You have to have about 4 cores there, running about 2.6 gigahertz. So, you're starting to push more into the workstation environment, especially with Revit, and that's relevant to the file size and complexity of the model as well. The more complex the model, the more RAM you're going to need, and more processing, etc. And then as well as some of the tools and plugins that you're running. I think that is a very fascinating question, and as I mentioned in kind of my portion there, I think what we'll start to see is a lot of these tools starting to be offered on kind of a service type of platform where they're using maybe Amazon Web Services or other off-system services there that you can leverage abroad servers or whatnot to utilize some of the processing. And I think that's where the graphic we have right here for BIM level 3 is really going to blow up, and you'll really start to see some of the site modeling tools start to increase a bunch because the processing needed for that is a bit heavier. And likewise for any of vegetation and maybe even rendering within the suites themselves, so you don't have to go to another platform to do the rendering. But look up some of the requirements online. I would say all the softwares have that. So I'll jump over to another question from Renee again. It's asking what we found is the best way to learn Vectorworks.
I'll chime in on that. I started in 2009. I'm a pretty quick learner when it comes to software, so I'm probably not the example here, but I found that their resources and help throughout the way, they actually offer a community forum that you can log into that'll help with little processes. You can ask questions. There's best practices and things on there. I know they're constantly trying to get better at how they interface with their learning and their tutorials. It's actually been a little bit of a criticism of theirs, is that they don't offer right out of the box manuals and the old kind of traditional way of learning. They have a more hands-on approach to their learning, which for some people makes it more difficult. That being said, I think the forum, the community forum that's around Vectorworks is one of the most engaged. There are simply people out there that are willing to help you with any question you have. I work with a guy here down the coast who he'll like just do work for me for free sometimes because I ask him, can this be done? And he'll just like write a script, this crazy thing, and I'll get it back. And it's like, oh, I was asking, was it capable? You didn't have to do it for me. It's a really engaged platform that Vectorworks offers. And I think some of the other software have that kind of community forum thing as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. Renee, your question's, a sensitive one, so I'll kind of divulge some information here. You probably gathered by my bio, I'm 50-something at this point. And I started 10 years ago, so, I'm not going to be like the sponge that some of the younger people are and when it comes to learning things. And, I went I lived near their headquarters, Vectorworks headquarters in D.C., so I went to their on-site core and introductory level classes. And after that, I've pretty much done everything self-taught. They did used to produce a manual for Landmark that you could purchase, and it had example drawings in it. But with the advent of YouTube and these other learning channels, it just wasn't really working for them as a business model. So they're moving over to that. So it's a bit of kind of just get into it, start messing around. You really can't break it kind of approach. But also to what Eric was saying, the online user group is great. He mentioned having somebody down the coast help him. Well, when I get into a problem, I can post things, particularly like Marinette scripts, what I'm not that great at, but I like to leverage them. And I didn't really talk about Marinette too much, but it's similar to Dynamo that Matt was referring to, excuse me, where you can string together commands and create, the imagination is the limit. You can create whatever you want out of Marinette. But if I run into a problem, I'll post it on this forum, and I literally get the head software programmer for Marinette, for Vectorworks, and she will chime in and solve the problem and send you the file back. And so it's pretty great. They are very helpful on their online forum. And then I've gotten assistance from people in Australia and New Zealand. As a matter of fact, I was in Australia back last summer and met one of the guys in person in Sydney just to have a have a pint and just chat about Vectorworks. So it's a very beneficial thing. And then kind of a shameless plug, I think I indicated I provide training and consulting for firms, so you can just contact me as well.
Yeah, and I think the same stands for Revit. There's a lot of information out there. There are a few, blogs that I would recommend if you're interested in using Revit. And one thing that I'm kind of working on just as a personal project is using actually Vectorworks and transitioning into Revit and kind of figuring out, what are some of the data losses and things like that. And so, hopefully there's some information that can be published soon on that workflow. But there's a lot of information just out on the web to learn these various programs. So I'll jump to the next question. How does drafting details differ in the BIM workflow compared to the more traditional CAD workflow? Maybe you guys could touch on that briefly.
I'll jump right in on that. It's both similar and dissimilar depending on the level of BIM that you want to use. We still use old two-dimensional details that were drafted in AutoCAD and converted to Vectorworks. And we place those in a very similar workflow as you would have in AutoCAD. I've yet to find a good reason to do a complicated BIM methodology for a typical concrete paving detail, for example. It's a pretty straightforward section cut. The BIM workflow idea of doing details is that theoretically you've modeled everything and your detail is nothing but a section cut through a small portion of the detail you want to show, and you annotate that section cut so that if the model changes, the section changes and the detail updates along with it. Now that's the ideal in a BIM, but as I mentioned, I'm not going to do that for an irrigation head detail, for a concrete paving detail. I will do that, however, for a more complicated, as is showing on your screen, like Robert's here. I'll let him talk more about it. But for a more complicated, like construction detail, a trellis, something very custom, I will do cut sections of it to show the detailing. So I'll let Robert chime in a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, I went back to this particular slide here for that very reason, because it plays perfectly into it. When I first did this trellis, this pergola design, I got, all sorts of crazy about putting in fasteners in 3D, and, it made the model way too silly large. So it was more of a process of, like Eric had just intimated, using the model to kind of communicate the overall design, but then when it comes to, showing fasteners, the type of fastener, et cetera, that was all done as kind of like just like in AutoCAD, there's a model space and design and paper space in Vectorworks. So it's a matter of just annotating the drawing over top. And there are times where you're working on the section, you realize, I forgot to incorporate how the corner posts and this planter are going to be fastened. So I had to make some modifications to the BIM model, but then I just, showed this material here for the drainage board. That's literally just a 2D thing drawn in the viewport of the annotation space. So it's, it's not going into a whole lot of like, I got to model that thing exactly too. It's you use the general concept and then you embellish it with line work.
Exactly.
All right, we'll jump to the next question. Thanks, guys. I don't have much to add to that. I think you covered it. So, other question is Vectorworks similar to Land Effects where it requires CAD? I'll just quickly answer that. Vectorworks is a standalone suite, whereas Land Effects is built to work on top of AutoCAD. So they are scripting essentially off of all the kind of CAD scripting platform there. So essentially, you're kind of working with a standalone program. Mm-hmm. So to jump to the next question, what do you think is more useful to learn, Revit or Vectorworks? Which is more user-friendly or more difficult? That is a very good question, and we could probably spend a whole session on that.
We could. We could go on for hours about this.
Yeah, I guess to summarize it, maybe you guys could add in, and then I'll kind of end with my thoughts on it.
I think for landscape architecture, out of the box, I have never worked in Revit. I don't know, but from what I know about other people and hearing stories, out of the box, Vectorworks has more tools ready for you to use, whereas Revit requires you to kind of build those in what they call libraries and components, that you have to build more of those custom things because Revit's more geared for architecture. They haven't spent the time to build those kind of libraries into the software yet. I think they'll probably get there at some point, but out of the box, Vectorworks is more user-friendly for landscape architecture. Now, if it's user-friendly as far as coordination, a lot of places are getting pushed into Revit because that's what everyone else is using. There's another question a little further down where I think we could talk briefly about the compatibility between the two. That's where it becomes a little bit more interesting. And we could, again, have a whole session on that. But out of the box, I would say Vectorworks is more user-friendly.
Yeah, Matt, I'm sure you got a quickie on that. We got about 4 minutes left. But on the Revit, I mean, obviously I'm a bit jaded because I'm using only the one platform. But, you know, all you have to do is look as far as their literature. They have, Autodesk has not made any kind of like intimation that they're even interested in providing kind of a suite of tools that you get with Vectorworks or Landmark, or not Landmark, but Dynascape or something like that, where it's geared towards our industry and, you know, having planting tools, et cetera. So that's about all I have to say on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll chime in just briefly because I do use both more on some hypothetical projects. Most recently, we've been testing the two. I will say that Vectorworks is a little bit more user-friendly. Revit has a lot of tools, but they're kind of catered more to architects and MEP type of disciplines. Now, there are ways to use other type of plugins and tools within Revit, but you know, you start to kind of get into a third-party realm, and it's not built within the suite, so that introduces other challenges just in terms of kind of updates and things like that. I will say, though, that as far as being more useful, I think that's a very interesting question because I think it all relates to, you know, how you're coordinating or how you're exchanging files with architects, you know, or other disciplines. And to me, that's kind of the end use of it as well, is that ability to collaborate. And, you know, as the graphs show, Revit is the dominant player there with architects. It's just the challenge there is that it doesn't offer the abundant tools that Vectorworks does. So I think it's kind of going back to Robert said and what we've kind of mentioned is, you know, how do we work between the two, you know, to be able to exchange files, you know, use the tools that are very user-friendly and built up in Vectorworks, and then, you know, take that and transition it into Revit. At least that's kind of where my current study is, you know, and being able to interoperate between the two. So, you know, again, we're happy to take any of these questions at a later time, and you know, we can follow up on that one specifically because, you know, that's a moving target as well. And year to year, these things change.
Yeah, I would say to kind of sum that up, there's the question at the end: compatibility between Revit and Vectorworks. Revit. You look at the two softwares when you're doing your study and figure out which one plays better with others. Traditionally, Autodesk has never really worried about coordination because they've been dominant. Vectorworks has to coordinate. So the compatibility issues is a really interesting and long discussion that I think we need to have a larger one as our profession about how we fit into this world. Are we going to be forced into Revit because they dominate the market, don't really want to play well with others? Or are we going to have the flexibility to work in different workflows that work better for us? Interesting discussion.
Yes.
Yeah,
and then it goes back to the... Sorry, go ahead. So I was just going to add that it kind of goes into the AIA definition, and really think that the goal there is for really there to be a open kind of suite there of just these file protocols that you can use whatever program you want, and that data is still intact within that file. That's not really the case as you start to get into it a bit more, but it's better now than it's ever been. And actually, Vectorworks has done a lot to allow for Revit files to be imported directly into their suite. So there's actually a direct import button that you can take a Revit file, import it directly in. There's some tools like that within Revit, but it's a little bit more challenging going the other way. So, again, that can change overnight.
And I would say it did change overnight too. Revit version 2018 no longer plays very nicely with others. So 2017 was a different story, and their newest version, they're not. The compatibility has changed, and so you're kind of at the whim. And I would say that's very true with, again, Autodesk. Traditionally, you're kind of at the whim of how they choose to run their marketing campaign and for lack of a better whatever, dominate the world. If they choose that they're better off by not collaborating, you're at the whim of that. So something to keep in mind.
And then I think, Robert, you had a final.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we're just running up against our time now, so we're starting to lose people. So whatever closing housekeeping you need to do, Matt, and thank everyone for their time.
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, we'll stick around for a couple minutes to answer the remaining questions, but for those of you who have to sign off, we do thank you for joining us today. We feel that this is a very critical topic, especially as we see mandates starting to pop up here and there, and then just in general with kind of the overall atmosphere that we're feeling from the industry, that Revit and Vectorworks and all these BIM tools are starting to be pushed a bit more. And so, for us, again, I think it's prudent for us as an industry, to stay relevant amongst our AE consultants and other team members there, to really explore these tools and see how we can utilize those to make our presence known, I guess, in that type of atmosphere. So thanks again. We'll continue with some of the Q&A, but feel free to sign off, and then feel free to reach out to us as well if you have any other questions or would like to just chat with us on some of these topics. So for those of you sticking around, we'll go through just some of the remaining questions. There's a few here that I think we could kind of combine together. So one of the questions was, you're wondering how you can handle Civil 3D files within Revit, if it's compatible, and if you're having any issues because of AutoCAD components, 3D components. I'll touch on that. So Civil 3D does play nicely, at least with Revit, in that sense that they're both Autodesk oriented or they're created. For instance, I do a lot of topo modeling in Revit. Actually, that's my preferred workflow, to create a topo. Actually, even for SketchUp. So what I'll do is I'll take a GIS file, even as a point cloud, take it into Revit, and then create a topo file, and has a lot of tools there. But you can do the same with the Civil 3D file, and take it right into Revit, and then generate a topo, import it in, modify it, etc. So it acts as a live link as well, where you can have a civil working on it, and then link it back into the Revit file and have that updated. So that's pretty fluid, at least between Revit and Civil 3D. And I'll jump into the next question. What's the best way to learn Revit for landscape architecture? So there's a couple books floating out right now. One one that was written by Autodesk, actually, for landscape architecture. My only critique about that is that there's not a lot of information on other plugins and other tools that are third-party. It just kind of talks about, really Revit itself and how it can be used in landscape architecture. But there's also some other tools out there and other resources that you could look into. The gal that I mentioned, Lauren Schmidt, has a blog that has a lot of tools or some information in there, as well as plugins and things like that she references, including Dynamo that I covered. And then, there's other blogs and forums out there. So, use the resources on the web, and you can find some other literature there to learn Revit. And then compatibility between Revit and Vectorworks, since a lot of architects use Revit. I think we touched on that. I don't want to go into that too much again, but
I wanted to just chime in, Matt. Matt, I just wanted to add, you talked about the Revit, and Eric touched on being able to bring in a Revit file. But going back to the IFC, I've used the import Revit into Vectorworks, and the files end up being these like crushingly huge data sucks. So what we've learned though is, we just ask for the skin of the building, because they'll just send you the whole model, and because they have a proprietary compression program, when it gets on the other end, it balloons out of control. So
right.
The best way is using IFC files, personally.
That's been our experience as well.
Right, and I'll say just from just some of my visual work through Revit and taking some Revit files into 3ds Max, I mean, that's the challenge as well. If you have a lot of the interior stuff modeled out and you're trying to bring that in, it's just going to kill your file. My recommendation there is there's some ways within Revit to turn off certain layers and then export. So you can freeze off certain families or different type of categories there that are relevant to a discipline, and then export that out. I think it is going to be crucial for us to start exploring those tools, though, on how we can make a live link between the two, and really use the IFC or other protocols there to be able to interchange all that data. So I'll jump over to our final question here. So it's a Revit question again, and if you're starting to use Revit, how would you go about building up families and libraries? Are there online resources, sharing opportunities? That's a very good question, because and we talked about this at the last ASLA annual meeting, where we start to get into intellectual property when we are looking at these different families or objects that start to transcend into construction docs. And I think that the challenge there from an office standpoint is that if you were to share that data that has construction information and attributes to it, and there's something that's let's say it's not even intentional, or it's kind of behind the scenes. Maybe there's something about that detail that's applicable just to a specific area, but then it's used in another area, and some type of litigation comes out of it. Who's liable for that? Is it the individual who created that detail, or the person who put it on their set? So I think there's a lot of discussion there, and kind of release of liability and all that before you can kind of open up the sharing opportunities. But I think one of the fascinating things, going back to that graph of BIM level 2 to BIM level 3, is really that sharing, because I think that's where we'll really start to see this kind of blowing up really of all the available families and tools within Revit. And I think it starts with a lot of the manufacturers as well. That's kind of the case for a lot of the the families within Revit currently. A lot of these are from manufacturers, and they'll send out just abundant families of, their windows or doors, door handles, sinks, etc. And I think the same thing can occur for the exterior of the building as well. And then, likewise with, some of the irrigation tools and stuff. That is actually how Vectorworks operates. They leverage some of the tools that are databases that are out there, from some of the leading manufacturers, especially in irrigation, and then use that for information within their suite. So I think that's the starting point there, is using information that's available. But then I do think there's also this discussion of amount of users, and I think as we start to see the amount of users go up in no matter what suite, you'll start to see some of these files being shared, or at least produced, and then potentially shared. I think that's going to be critical as well. And then I do think there is probably a need for maybe some type of open source file exchange to take place, and we just realized that, hey, this is beneficial for us as an industry. Let's start sharing these things, and if we get past the whole liability and some of the other nuances to it, I think there's going to be a lot of benefit there, such as the case with SketchUp and their shared warehouse. There's a lot of benefit to having just that data available and being able to quickly model something up because of that.
Yeah, I would agree. Once you start to get in the BIM world, it becomes really easy to see where we're all going. It's been fun to be a part of it here for the last 6 or 7 years, and start to imagine that you start modeling these fun little things and get in it, and then you realize, man, it's way easier to communicate the ideas of how this thing should be built and how this coordinates with everything else when I'm in this 3D digital world. And the minute I have to translate that onto paper, it becomes there's almost like it's something lost, or it's a harder translation there. So it becomes easy to see that we're going to this place where we're going to be sharing our models, and it's going to be about getting the architects and the whole consultant team into this space. Where this space is, I don't know yet, and I don't think anyone knows, but into this space where architects, cities, plan reviewers, jurisdictions, that sort of thing can get in and understand what's going on without necessarily the use of traditional paper plans. Kind of a fun idea.
Yeah, and just on the whole kind of like sharing of information, Matt, you brought up the idea of the the potential litigation that might arise from it. I would contend that that utopian like view you're taking, Eric, is dangerous, because
it is.
Say I do my design and I send my importable file over to the architect, and they like make some modification as a last minute thing, and they don't notify you. Then what? It's like, well, that's not what our file was. You're going to have to go back to the server and show the date stamps are different or something like it. It's, and that's where Civil 3D with Revit. I was under the impression from another client that they have to basically export their stuff for the architects to use and vice versa. And it almost gives them a finer bit of control over the potential liability. Because if it's,
right. The date stamp
totally in their realm, it's their fault.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, there is some difficulty there when it's a shared file, essentially, and you're modeling things in there that can be moved. Whereas if it's an input or import rather, then it's kind of memorialized based on that send and that transition there. So. That's, I think, going to be a critical thing for us to tackle once we start to get into that a bit more. And honestly, I think that could be a conversation that we have, in some of these upcoming forums within the field. Also, on some of the other social media sites. Land 8's a great place for us to continue this discussion, as well as our annual meetings. having these forums where we just discuss some of the ramifications of these various tools that we're using, and just some of the just some of the law behind it as well, and kind of bringing that in. So with that said, thank you all for joining us today again, and then also sticking around for the remainder of the discussion. Feel free to reach out to us, and then follow some of the conversation just within the various platforms that I mentioned. I don't know if you guys have any closing statements.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks everybody for the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you guys as well, both Robert and Eric, for showing your information there and sharing that. I think it's a great service to the practice there. So thank you guys.